G'day and welcome to another episode of Quarantine Stories. My name is Martin Brennan, I'm a guide here, and let's explore some of the quarantine success stories or otherwise that happened here over the many years that it was open. Now, Quarantine Station was open for 156 years. It finally closed in 1984, and in that time 580 ships dropped anchor in this harbour and 572 people didn't make it out alive, and they're buried in our 3 cemeteries. The diseases that killed them were smallpox, typhus, typhoid, whooping cough, scarlet fever, bubonic plague, and of course the last pandemic to hit the world, Spanish influenza 100 years ago. But of course now we've got a new pandemic, COVID-19, and we'll discuss this later in the program. Spanish influenza, the last big pandemic to hit the world back in 1918-1919. Let's compare and contrast what happened then with what's happening today with COVID-19. Now, to recap, Spanish influenza infected 500 million people worldwide in 1918-1919. That was 1/3 of the world's population. The equivalent to that today would be 2.5 billion people. That's a big number. And we're nowhere near that at this point in time. And in terms of the deaths for Spanish influenza, 50 to 100 million people died. Looking at COVID at the moment, we've only got 10 million people infected, though many of us think that number is much greater. And the deaths so far, 500,000 people, a fraction of who died in 1918. However, we're only 3 months into the program. Only 3 months into the pandemic. Spanish influenza went on for 18 months, so we can't start counting what actually happens until the pandemic is actually over, and that could take a couple of years. Now, here in Australia, we've got a death rate today of about 104. Spanish influenza, we had 13,000. So you can see there's a major difference between what happened 100 years ago and what's happening today. Major advances in medicine and technology has made us able to cope far, far better than they could 100 years ago. We're going to examine some of those people that were around in that time, and we're going to visit their gravesides later on in this program. We've come up here to the 2nd cemetery at the quarantine station, where over 100 people are buried. But today there's only one grave left standing, and that is of a little boy called Isaac Lowe. He arrived here in 1878 on board a ship called the Samira, where scarlet fever was rampant. Being a little boy and not strong enough to withstand this horrible disease, he succumbed to his disease here at the quarantine station on August the 28th, 1878, and he's buried here in this burial ground with this lovely ornate iron railing put there by his parents to ensure he was never forgotten. And today we make sure that he's honoured by remembering this little boy who had such a short life. Isaac had a very best friend on board the ship, and his friend was called Thomas Convoy. Unfortunately, Thomas also succumbed to scarlet fever the same week Isaac did. And befittingly of a best friend, he's buried next to Isaac here. We can't see his grave here, but we do know from pictures that he was buried next to his best mate. And it's very fitting to make sure we don't forget and we honour these 2 short lives today and forever. Let's come and have a look at the 3rd cemetery. Follow me. I've come now to the third cemetery at North Head from the quarantine station, where over 240 people are buried. This dates back from 1881 to 1924. The diseases that are mainly prevalent here: smallpox, bubonic plague, and the last one, Spanish influenza. I'd like to talk to you about a particular grave standing next to me. And it's of a very special person called Private Hector Frazer Hicks. He enlisted in the AIF in 1918 and was off to war in the steamship Medic in November 1918. The route was from Sydney to Auckland, to Tahiti, to Panama, and on to Europe for the war. But within 5 days of setting sail from Sydney, the armistice was declared and the war was over. There was no need for him to go to war. The steamship Medic had over 1,000 people on board, comprising soldiers, Italian reservists, and crew. They decided to turn back and go to Wellington for a few days before returning to Sydney. That was a fatal mistake. While in Wellington, they picked up Spanish influenza. And by the time they returned to Sydney, there were over 300 cases on board the ship. Immediately on arriving in Sydney, 60 of these people were brought straight to the quarantine station. And over the following weeks, 12 AIF soldiers died, 9 reservists, Italian reservists died, and 2 nurses died, Annie Egan and Elizabeth McGregor. You may have heard of Elizabeth McGregor and Annie Egan from a previous quarantine story. This is the grave to Hector Frazer Hicks. He died on the 30th of November 1918, aged 18 years and 9 months. Basically, he was cut in the prime of his life. A very handsome man who had so much to look forward to. His parents put this wonderful gravestone together and wrote a little important line here, which sums up his life. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. The ultimate sacrifice. Next to him is Annie's grave. And Annie was the nurse who died the following week in December 1918, contracting Spanish influenza from the soldiers returning from the Medic. And she's buried next to the private, and they both were given full military honours.